And thank you, Chrissy, for being with us. We are now live streaming. I want to welcome everyone to, this is the meeting of the Select Committee on the Future of Public Higher Education in Vermont. It's Monday, February 8th. Before we get into the agenda, I just want to remind people, members of the public, that if you have comments or you want to raise questions, please submit those in writing. And it's at the bottom of our agenda, but just for people who perhaps don't have it, it's Higher Ed Committee, that's all one word, at leg.state.vt.us. And we will leave time at the end. Joyce Manchester monitors that, and so she will share the comments or the questions, and we will always post your comments on our website. So they are part of the public documentation. So with that, I just want to welcome people to today's meeting. The purpose of today, I just want to remind people that NCHEMS has been working really hard, as you can see from the report that we got on Friday, that we we are due to send our second draft of the report by this Friday. And our report now, I think, is up over 170 pages, 178 to be exact. So some of you probably already have it all memorized, but we won't embarrass anyone to start reciting it, except for Brian. But there's a lot of information in there. And the purpose of today's meeting is to review some of the key sections to make sure that we are all in sync with the language and support it. You know, I think as I was reading this and as the steering committee met last time, and in my conversations with Brian and Dennis and Sally, I think one of the things that I just want to name up front here is that this new report represents a tremendous amount of work by NCHEMS, and I really want to thank them for that. But I also want to recognize that, and this is something we agreed to at the very beginning, is our first report would really be substantive and sort of set the stage for the rest of the work. So I think you will find that although there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of additions, I hope you'll agree with me that it doesn't substantially change the 20,000 foot description of where we think Vermont needs to head as a result of this report. And so today we're going to because it's so dense and such a big document, that we're going to focus on, I've asked Brian to focus on 3 areas. One is the executive summary, one are the recommendations, and then the third is the implementation steps. And the implementation steps really came about as a result of some requests that we had, Brian and I, when we went to a number of the legislative committees. Asking, can you give us a sense of how you see this taking place? And so I just want to thank NCHEMS for sort of mapping out what they think of is a reasonable timeline. But so I'm going to ask Brian to focus on leading us through a conversation and highlighting the changes in those 3 places: the executive summary, the recommendations, and the implementation steps. I will also say that because it is so dense, we're going to try to get to everyone's comments, but always remember, you can reach out and submit your comments or have an email conversation. Brian and Dennis are so incredibly responsive. So if you have thoughts or you have a question about a wording and we don't get to it today, please don't hesitate to reach out to them. But also know that our next report for them is due to our legislative leadership and the governor's office on Friday. So with that, I want to turn it over to Brian to lead us through. The one thing I want to just mention, I know a couple of people have to leave early. Be on the lookout for a note from Candace, because we've had to change a couple of the dates. We're sticking to the same Monday for the select committee, but just as an FYI, we're going to be meeting on March 1st instead of March 8th, and we're meeting on April 5th instead of April 19th. You don't have to write that. We'll send you a note about that, but we've had to make some changes. And I'm hoping that we might be able to meet a little earlier because we've had a couple of people let us know that there's conflicts later in the day, but maybe move it up a half an hour or so. So this committee will be meeting again on March 1st and on April 5th, but we'll be sending you invites on that. So with that, Brian, I want to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. And I always have to begin by asking if everybody can hear me properly. I've come outfitted with my headphones right from the beginning of this time. So yes, nods or something? Okay, great. So as Joyce said, we did a lot of work. We made a lot of changes to the document, but most of them were to fill out stuff that had previously been an outline form, or we relocated some pieces. And so, you know, the red line that you all got was littered with changes, but I think we'll concentrate on the most important ones here. So, and I'll just kind of run through them real quick. I want to make sure that nothing in this very long document is a surprise to any of you by not having actually mentioned it. So first off, we have added recommendations in the executive summary. I'm sure you all noticed these. They're not new recommendations. They were in the document that we submitted in December 4th in the recommendations section, but we've elevated those recommendations to the executive summary. And the first one was just a very brief articulation of the case for urgency. The second one was the recommendation that the legislature craft a series of clear statewide objectives for the Vermont State Colleges. And then the third one was a recommendation around the adoption of the affordability standard. The second really substantive change, in some respects, in other respects it wasn't substantive, is that we created a new presentation of the state investments. These were the two tables in the prior report that generated a substantial amount of conversation amongst us. Now there's 4 tables. I hope this isn't an exponential growth function we're talking about here, but the new tables were done to try to bring greater clarity to the request. I think we've learned some things by having spoken to the legislatures over the last couple of weeks, a month or so. I think this group knows that certainly Senator Baruch and Representative James know that I've been virtually present at more of the Vermont legislature than the Colorado one, where I'm living anyway. So we wanted to bring clarity to the request for the state investments, and we wanted to make it more evident that the select committee's focus has been on the structural deficit component of the question of the fiscal sustainability of the Vermont State College system, while also showing that the COVID mitigation costs that the state college system is facing are real and they will have to be addressed. But generally speaking, as we see events evolve, the federal stimulus package has already helped with that in some regard, and there continues to be a discussion about what that might look like, how much that might be, and what form it might take. But really the purpose of these changes to the table and the addition to a chart of a graph was to sort of help the legislators and others who are reading the report zero in on the structural deficit component of the system's deficit. We added, not in the exact, now and I want to definitely leave time for folks to comment on that section, but just to sort of be comprehensive about the introduction to the changes, not currently anywhere in the executive summary. I think we're going to at least add a reference, but there's a whole new section outlining implementation steps. Some of those implementation steps have timelines, roughly speaking, suggested for elements of that. The ones that do are more within the domain of the Vermont State College Board and the Chancellor's Office. And then we made a number of changes to the language. We added some elements related to the adult CTE and adult education and literacy issue we were discussing previously, and a recommendation related to that. We tried to streamline the discussion around the affordability standard to better clarify that as a metric and not as a mechanism for the distribution of state aid, which I think was an area where we introduced the possibility of confusion in our original wording. We also included a minimum data request related to that. And you'll note, and here's where I was worried we might surprise you, we added a new recommendation in that section for your consideration regarding a new requirement for high school graduates to have completed the federal financial aid the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid form. This is a requirement that's in place in some other states. It's under consideration in a variety of others. And given that the Congress has authorized a sharp reduction in the complexity of that form, we thought it might be something for the select committee may want to consider. And the last thing I'll say about the changes, and we can dig into it, is that we also tried to make some adjustments to the language around the role of the chancellor's office and also the consolidation of administrative operations. These were really changes that we made to try to address perceptions we were hearing about, that the select committee was recommending a substantially large increase to the size of the chancellor's office, which I don't think was the intent we were aiming for. So hopefully the language changes that we put in there help to better clarify that stuff. And so that's really the substantive set of things that we did. And I'd like to make sure that we really deal with, as Joyce said, the issues around the new recommendations in the executive summary, the presentation of the state investment request, and if folks have things to say about the implementation steps, we're eager to hear those things as well. So do we want to start with the new recommendations that are in the executive summary? Great. As I said, there's 3 of them: the case for urgency, the statewide objectives, and the adoption of the affordability standard. So the floor, I guess, would be open for comments.
I just have a quick one, and that is that when it says the historic VSC state appropriation, including allied health, I think that number excludes allied health on the figure 3 chart.
And I think you told me that separately, and what I've done with that is just struck the parenthetical there. Okay. I know it's been, you actually, so I don't want to take, as I have maybe a little too quickly, silence as assent. So.
Comments that people have.
This is
So
Sandy.
I have one that, oh, go ahead, Sandy.
No, it's all good.
No, I was just going to say that I have shared with NCHEMS that I don't know if you guys found this, but I have to tell you, I found figure 5, the chart, the graph, really helpful, because now I feel like I can totally explain how this all works. It just, the clarity. And so I don't know if that helped others, but for me, you know, now it's a state appropriation, it's increasing the state appropriation, and it's the transformation costs going down. So I call that out to you because it just, for me, like I knew it, but now it's just very clear in my mind. So Brian, so thank you for putting that information just in a little different format.
So this is Sandy. My reactions were this. I really appreciate the leadership the steering committee has provided and the work of NEMCHES in this document. I think it's reading really, really well, and it's very clear. I really appreciated that. On page 1, I noted, and it's been there, but I noted in that first sentence, in order to achieve these objectives, the steering committee has agreed on these series of priority recommendations. Is it deliberately stated the steering committee? Is that
No.
a more powerful statement?
Nope, that is a mistake.
Okay.
That's been missed by everybody but you, Sandy. So thank you. I will fix that.
Okay. I didn't know if there's a good reason why it was meaty
Should
or
say
something.
the select committee.
Thank you for finding that.
I think I've almost figured out which one of these committees I'm talking about most of the time at this point, but caught me there.
I had a question.
Mhm.
I mean, if we're doing typos, there's in the very, very first sentence of the report, it should be the Select Committee on the Future of Public Higher Education in Vermont, but that's not my question. When you talk about investments in transformation, I think that later in the report, you explain that in more detail, what exactly that means. But even that section, I found myself wanting a little bit more. So either now or later in the report, I would love a really more specific kind of laundry list of the kind of things you're talking about when you say, and then we need additional money to invest in transformation. So maybe when we get to that section or now, I would just love to hear, a list of what we mean when we talk about that.
Okay. I will. Looking
Sorry,
for.
I can't remember where it is later in the report that I found it.
It's in the fifth recommendation in the recommendation section, which hopefully is easier to find with the table of contents now included. I'm so used to working at home now that I'm actually working with a hard copy from my office, and I'm finding it difficult to function.
That's okay. I mean, that's just my question. You don't need to look it up right now, or you can email me, or I can email Sophie. I'm sure Sophie knows as well.
No, I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what all those things are that I have in mind, specifically that we have in mind. They include things like, to some degree, they're going to be subject to the board's discretion to direct those resources in ways that meet the detailed level of transformative activities in the order in which best accomplish them. But broadly speaking, there I think is some need to fund the kinds of activities that lead to the to greater academic sharing, to engagement with the accreditors to try to bring the single accreditation together. There's Jeff Weld's concern and others as well. He's just the one that has articulated it about the branding issue associated with shifting from multiple institutions to one. That's going to require a marketing campaign and the costs associated with that. There are, I think that the board, my sense is that the state board has been meeting extremely frequently in the last year. I don't know how frequent that is compared to prior years, but there's going to be expenses associated with continuing that. There's very likely going to be the need for some external assistance to facilitate the changes as well. And so those are just some of the things that come to mind. And I'm trying to keep them in large enough buckets that we're not circumscribing the discretion of the board. I don't know if there were others that I'm missing, Dennis, that you might share with the group.
Brian, I don't think you said, and one of the big ones is the new administrative data systems that have to be put in place.
Yeah. And you'll note too, Representative James, that the prior version of these tables had a distinction between funds to be used for operational transformation and funds to be used for capital transformation. And I want to be clear, we still think that those are usages that are important. So there's a considerable amount of money that would be needed to either repurpose or repurpose some physical space, or to possibly to demolish what makes sense to demolish if it's no longer useful. And those are going to have high costs as well. That stuff is now included in one line item in order so that the, once again, the state board has, and the legislature have discretion over how to make those funds available and make use of them.
And where does deferred maintenance
That deferred
fit in
maintenance,
here?
deferred maintenance falls under the ongoing capacity issue, as
Okay.
well as major maintenance.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Joyce,
Yes?
is it all right if I
Yeah.
raise a question?
Yeah.
So this is on page 1, and it has to do with the Vermont legislature articulating in statute the goals. And I'm glad to see that. I have spoken with Senator Campion, who's chairing Senate Ed now. He's amenable to bringing forward the discussion and trying to move something. It occurs to me reading over that again, it gives examples of things that might be clarified. There's one that's not mentioned that was a point of some panic when Chancellor Spaulding's plan came out. People immediately began to search for where the authority lay to close a campus, sell a campus, transfer a campus, et cetera. And so Ledge Council went into it, and basically their opinion, although they wasn't 100%, but more or less they thought that the trustees retained the power to close a campus, to cease offering educational opportunities there, but not to sell it. And I think that it would be good if we're going to go to the work of clarifying the statute to make that point crystal clear. So if it is the desire to have the trustees have the ability to close campuses or to vote to stop offering, then that should be articulated as a basic principle. If it's the idea that that responsibility should rest with the legislature, we should clarify that. So that could be an issue for both committees of jurisdiction in the legislature, but I think it would be good to cue them to take it up by adding it to that set of examples. I don't know how you would phrase it, but just so we don't have, lawmakers searching for legal remedies that we could easily clarify.
Gotcha.
And Senator Ruth, do you think we should definitely and clarify in terms of, just like what you said, in terms of closing versus selling?
Yes, because when Jeb Spaulding's report came out, you remember there was an outcry in the land, and all manner of legislators went running to Ledge Council and were told there wasn't really a firm answer. They were going to give their opinion, but it was clear that it would head to a lawsuit ultimately if the situation went forward and those 3 campuses were actually going to close their doors. So I don't see why we wouldn't clarify both, because right now it's pretty clear that the legislature needs to be in charge of selling a campus, but it isn't crystal clear who can close it down.
I would just flag, because the way the current statute is written, it also prohibits us from leasing, selling, disposing, abandoning, but leasing is something that we do have an interest in doing, and maybe in selling some of the extraneous pieces of the campus that we're not using. So that's just something to bear in mind. I mean, I get, like, if we were selling the entire campus, right, the General Assembly would want to weigh in. But if it's a question of, can we lease this building to a local nonprofit who's going to possibly employ students doing internships and things, I'm not sure that's something that the legislature wants us to come and get permission from them before we do it. So
Good point.
I think we can write some things in there related to leaving the legislature, or the legislature would retain authority to sell
Well-
the grounds of a campus.
I think it might be better just to toss the whole discussion to the committees of jurisdiction, assuming that they're going to rewrite the statute anyway. But I think Chancellor Zadatny's point is a good one, that there may be ways in which the duty split is different both ways, that the legislature acquires some new power and the trustees acquire some new power, say over leasing or demolition and leasing.
Yeah, that statute, that piece, I don't believe has changed since the statute was written in 1963 or 64. And I think we've conceived it of the legislature gave that land to the colleges, to the Vermont State Colleges Corporation. So that is sort of how I viewed it, was the legislature gave that property when it created it, the Lyndon State College, school and whatever. But
Yep.
Again, we're at a place where we are looking to get rid of some of the physical infrastructure that we don't need. So we don't want to be hampered in doing that, because I think that's in everyone's interest to have us move forward with that.
Sarah?
Okay.
I threw into the chat just more wordsmithing finds on page 6, but I just wanted to call your attention to two things on page 6. The first is, I thought that paragraph that starts that page with if implemented, these recommendations will help usher into existence a re-envisioned VSC system that will be with all the bullet points. That might actually be a great paragraph to put before the recommendations. It's just a suggestion. But then more importantly and more substantively, the last paragraph, which I love, and I also want to call to the attention of the select committee, that we did have some conversations about whether we should make specific recommendations around adult CTE and adult education and literacy programs, which some of you may know as adult basic ed. So we've had some of those conversations and are recommending to the select committee that we not make specific recommendations, but rather identify that there's an opportunity to bring that, to connect that system better with the Vermont State College system. But what I think might be lacking a little bit in that paragraph is that the purpose for doing that isn't just sort of organizationally to give those programs a different configuration that would connect them. It is also a way to expand the customer, I guess I would say, of the Vermont State College system, which is, in my mind, an adult learner, and provide a more seamless experience in accessing various points of adult education. And so I don't know if that's worthy of some further clarification, or maybe I've missed that it's later on in the document. So I just wanted to point out that when we're making that, when we're identifying that as a potential area for some future thought, that there are a couple of good reasons to do that. And then also I wanted to see if there was interest in putting a finer point on the opportunity for the state college system to, whether it's in the chancellor's office or not, but to really provide some dedicated organizational component of itself that is tasked with providing outreach and services to employers to better connect them with customized trainings or degree bearing opportunities or certificate programs. But to the extent that that can also begin to look like a new place, a new revenue source for the state colleges, I think we need to, if others agree with me that it is an opportunity, I think we need to make that a little bit more clear And in either doing that in the executive summary or detailing it even more later on in the report.
So you reminded me, Sarah, with that comment that I think that letter D under the third recommendation is new. Oops.
What page is that on, Brian?
On page, it's the top of page 2. I'm checking to my red line version
yeah.
to see if I. Yeah, that's new, and I can't remember what prompted it, or if you prompted it.
I think so.
And this could very well be my attempt to be responsive to something you said on a previous call on that issue in the section related to mission, as opposed to in the section related to administrative services.
Yep.
So, but I may have missed the mark a little bit, and you are a terrific writer, I've already learned. So you're welcome to offer up any improvements you care to if that doesn't quite get there.
Yeah. I'm also just,
go ahead.
I don't know if I'm the only one that thinks that there's an opportunity there, but I've just, I look to, Steve Gordon, who did have some success in partnering with CCV as an example of a model where, if we look at our colleges and try to better connect them with employers, they could be a future, we're just a new customer in a non-traditional way. But I feel like I've said that a couple of times, but I don't know if I'm the only one saying it, or if there are others here who think that there's a better way to sort of organizationally recommend that or present that to the legislature. So I don't want you just to implement it, Brian, because I'm a squeaky wheel. I do really want to make sure that this is something that others care about or feel strongly about.
Well, let me just say that it fits with what we think. So if you're a squeaky wheel, it's just a matter of us trying to get the words right. But the other folks in the group, and Sandy's got her hand up, I can see, may have something to say in particular. So Sandy, go ahead.
Sarah, as an employer, I am very much in alignment with you, firmly in alignment with you. I look forward today of talking about other elements in the report related to employers and partnerships. So Sarah, I'm directly in alignment with what you're proposing. You're not alone.
For what it's worth, we're currently working on what it would look like if we were to implement the recommendations of the select committee coming out of the initial report. And that's definitely a concept that we're currently exploring is having a separate workforce continuing education division. So again, if it's in this report, that will be helpful for us moving forward.
I'd like to be able to find in the report, you talk about, it's much further down about large employers not having been as involved as they could be, perhaps. Did I pick that up correctly?
And
I
think we probably were talking about Vermont as a place relative to other states of not having a lot of large employers, and that creates some challenges that we have in terms of implementing solutions that we've used in other states about having the employers pull the other sectors of the political economy along in some respects. But it's a little harder because there's fewer large employers relative to small employers in your state.
So I picked up that point. So I wondered if there's a way of reframing that to strongly encourage your mid and small employers to become more actively engaged, because that is where the majority of employers are. So is there a way of reframing that somehow so that we're asked mid, small employers to step up as well, because we don't have a lot of large employers? Yes,
and are you thinking of a specific place in the document that you're thinking that goes? Is that where Sarah was talking about too?
Yes, and what I'll do is I'll email you the section because I'm flipping through the document now. Okay. I do have highlighted areas, but I'll identify that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
I think it can also be, associations like Vermont Hospital Association, which Sophie and I have been chatting about as well, because majority of the hospitals in Vermont are critical access hospitals, small hospitals, but together we represent through VAS, a pretty significant employer base, and Business Roundtable, so I don't want to just focus on individual employers, I think, and you're right, because there aren't that many big ones. We are the biggest in Brattleboro, actually in Windham County, but we're small by standard. But I think there's a lot of business related associations that should be mentioned.
And if I may just also point out, you can use an example, Brian, of VTC currently really serves and has really grown into this role as the organizer, and almost like it creates the employer association for companies who do electrical work. So for the electrical apprentices, there are a lot of employers who are rather large, but many of the businesses that they work with to both stand up the standards and place the apprentices are, 1 and 2 people operations. And so the state colleges already have an example of where, they have staff that are dedicated to organizing those employers and then connecting that to the related instruction.
We similarly at Vermont work with GW Plastics, and we had the entire GW Plastics lab on campus. And in that facility, we're able to, one, build internships for people to go to, find different positions for after students graduate from Vermont Tech to go to GW Plastics directly. So we actually have built a fairly good environment for finding internships and companies to work with the school, apply scholarships. Even I earned a scholarship from All Earth Renewables after doing an internship with them over the summer.
So I think that there is a bunch of this stuff in the document where we talk about the role of the chancellor's office. Am I remembering that right? Which might be too far buried, but Dennis, am I recalling that, including the part that Sophie said about a particular need for employer and workforce development services?
It's in there, but I'm going to have to do some looking to find it.
That's what I'm trying to do, listen and look at the same time. I'm not sure it's going
Well,
so well.
we have the message. We don't have to.
Yeah, but I guess a question I have is, does it seems like it might be important enough to not leave it buried on page 60 something or whatever, and actually put it more clearly in the executive summary. So the question for the group. I mean, it's in there now under this broad concept of serving students better, adult students, and in relationship in that section D that we were mentioning before. But it doesn't necessarily clarify that a real shift in the approach that the system might take with leadership from the chancellor's office is to do these things in the executive summary.
Brian, this might be a place where you put it in the recommendations, because I feel like it's a recommendation that I'm worried that the executive summary, I don't want it to be too big, too dense, that then people don't read it and take away sort of the high points and then get them to the recommendations. But I think if we keep weighing down the executive summary, we need the executive summary to what is the 10% we want to make sure that they really take away.
Yep.
And then the recommendations are the next level down. And so I think that I want to be mindful of making sure we are making that distinction of what are the highlights and include them in the executive summary, recognizing that it's not inclusive of everything. But I think, and because I think there's reference in the recommendations to how important it is. And I think Sarah's point is spot on, and we need to make sure but I think if we can include it at a high level in the executive summary and then more detail in the recommendations, that to me feels like the right balance. Does that work for people?
Yeah, one of the suggestions I would make is in the executive summary that you even just include in there what the page numbers are for where the recommendation is. So if somebody wants to explore a particular recommendation, they can quickly get to it.
I was telling Brian earlier, I have to say also, when I was reading this, the biggest gift that I found was the table of contents was so helpful to me because I could keep flipping back instead of flipping through the pages. So Brian and Dennis, thanks for the table of contents.
Okay.
Other comments, feedback? Sarah.
So shifting gears to the, this is a question, to the recommendation about every high school student who graduates completing a FAFSA form. In theory, that sounds great, but I'm wondering, because I don't have any policy chops in this area, if you or maybe Scott or others might want to speak to the why Vermont would adopt it, and any I especially am interested in knowing what are naysayers going to say about this. Is this going to cause, you know, high school graduation rates to go down if they don't do that, Heather? So I'm not sure if there's a negative to that policy recommendation, but I'd just be curious to learn a little bit more about it before saying, yeah, that sounds awesome, because it seems too good to be true.
I think where the recommendations comes from is from some states that have had a requirement that they do this in place for some time. I'm not going to remember the states off the top of my head. Perhaps Scott knows them right away. It tends to lead to more students thinking about college as a realistic possibility. It helps address the information gaps about what kinds of funding is there and what college actually is likely to cost, even in states like Vermont that have relatively high rates. And so as a general rule, it's a step that we put in there as a way to address both affordability concerns and concerns about college going rates that may be reduced in part because of a lack of information and a lack of steps taken in planning in timely manner around getting the financial plan in place for college attendance. A lot of times the issue with FAFSA completion has been the extremely voluminous amount of information that's required for somebody to actually complete the form. And that will still be required, I believe, until 2023, when the simplified form will take over. But anyway, it's an attempt to. It doesn't cost anything in dollar terms for a student to complete it, and so states that have one in place have generally found that it boosts college aspirations, college planning, college going rates.
I would just add, this is Heather Boucher, I would just add that we have been doing this work with VSAC for a long time in terms of promoting universal FAFSA completion. So this shouldn't be a surprise to the field. The only thing that I think may come up is that, you know, there's to actually complete the FAFSA form, parents need to actually share information. So I think that might be where some of that language gets tinkered with, because I could see that our local school systems might be uncomfortable with that because that's a big ask on their part. But in terms of, you know, maybe we can tinker with the language when it gets to that point that would actually be a little bit more flexible around there. So definitely support the intention. The logistics might be a little bit tricky, but I think we're all on the same page, and it will just be the devil's in the details to get us there at that point. I'm very fine with the way it is for the recommendations for the report.
If I can piggyback a little bit off of kind of Heather's comments, because we've started some of these conversations in the past just because of the way the numbers play out. So when we look in Vermont, it dipped a little bit this past year, but 55 to 60% of Vermont seniors, high school seniors, that's really the first group we would look at, are completing the FAFSA, and that constitutes about 90% of the students that end up on campus. So some people have argued that there's a strong correlation. I'm not sure. I think that's a little strong, but the point that, Brian is making, I think is a good one. Where the pushback comes, and I think Heather was leaning into this more gently, is, two questions that the schools ask us, who is going to provide the student supports to make sure that this happens? Because even with the simplified form, there are challenges, it's just not, even when I can do the IRS download and just do a series of logins, we spend an incredible amount of time providing support to families. And that's even before you get to some of the cultural resistance that you have in some households about sharing private personal information with the government. So, and then, the second piece that we're always asked, at the backdrop, and that shouldn't stand in the way of the recommendation, is, are you going to require all students, knowing that not every student is planning on or needs to go on to traditional Title IV eligible institution? And are you prepared to tell somebody that they can't graduate if they feel, if they fail to fulfill the requirement? So to Heather's point, it's when you get down into the details is when we start to pick up the resistance at the local, kind of school district level. So, we have, on the one hand, with all the work that AOE and VSAC and the schools, have done together, we have not been able to move that needle on completion rates beyond, the 60% range. In our experiences, our numbers are lower than some states, but our experience is the same, which is what drives people to step into one of these graduation requirement models. Is that a fair statement, Heather?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't add anything else. As usual, we're kind of in line with each other, Scott. We usually are. So we work.
Heather and Scott, in states, or maybe even Brian, in states where they have moved to quote unquote the requirement, have they seen that change those stubborn figures?
That's a great question. It's relatively new, and I think some of the places that did it had promise programs involved as well, so that the two were pretty closely tied together, if I'm not mistaken.
I put a link in the chat that has some info about that.
Yeah. It's not a statewide, but Chicago Public Schools have that requirement.
And Dennis, have they seen a big uptick in FAFSA completion?
Yes. And college going. Because
So
essentially, when they do that, the students essentially get a piece of feedback that says, here's how much you're eligible for by way of support to go on to college. And they never thought about it before.
What's interesting for me about this is that I often think about, kind of to piggyback back on Scott with the notion about supports. So who is actually going to do this work with students? And, interestingly, in Vermont, we have a personalized learning plan that is already required for high school graduation. And so it's very, to kind of insert this requirement as part of the personalized learning plans makes absolute sense to me. Still the devil's in the details, but they're already working, they should be at the school level working in close connection with students on their personalized learning plan. So to have this be a component of that is where I would see it fitting in. And for instance, I'm not sure in Chicago whether they have that as a vehicle. So they've actually done it perhaps without some existing structures that we actually have as a state.
Yeah.
And I can't answer that question, Heather.
Yeah, and I think Arnie Duncan was actually the superintendent at the time that this was done.
Yep.
And the support piece was the first part that they, thought through. But Heather, what, Maine at one point had looked at a model, and I'm going to not do it justice, but was a little bit, it built on the PLP idea, even though I don't think that they had the instrument. And they said, more or less that as a function of graduation, every student needs to have a plan for what comes next. And that plan could include, a post-secondary education path that includes completing the FAFSA requirement. If it was an apprenticeship model, it required whatever step was involved were necessary for that. And if it was a work model, there were certain things, resume or other things, that needed to be done as part of the PLP, so that they could take the pressure off of the 100% requirement, on FAFSA. And, there might be some appeal to that because you could still get 80% of folks on the FAFSA side, but provide meaningful steps for those whose personalized learning plans take them in a different direction.
I agree, but I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that actually having them complete the FAFSA might actually help with informing students about that post-secondary decision, because we have a lot of families that I suspect don't really fully understand what financial assistance is available. And so they sort of preclude the idea of some kind of post-secondary training. So it's a fine needle for us to thread, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's just that the form itself doesn't do that. It's the conversation that takes place with it. And so we need to, that's why I was trying to embed it in the PLP so that it's part of a structured conversation rather than just a check mark.
Yeah, that's why I was identifying it as the structure, because the structure of that conversation is already there.
Yep.
By law, actually.
Jeff, thanks for sending. Jeff has put a link to an article in the chat that people might want to take a look at after today's meeting.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and that graphic is just the map that sort of shows what states are where in the legislative process.
Yeah. I just, I hear everybody's point. I just wonder if forcing somebody to do something or requiring them to do something is necessarily going to achieve the desired result. I mean, I get what people are saying, but I'd really like to see more correlation or more studies there.
I
Can I
think
throw something out a little different, kind of on the discussion about employers. If I was a member of the legislature and looking at the report, looking at the higher education system in Vermont, I would be asking, how is that system, if it's Vermont funded, going to positively impact the problems we have with the Vermont workforce? We've got a big problem in Vermont, finding professionals, finding others, technical, not just in healthcare, throughout. And that's where I see one of the value proposition that the state university system should be addressing. And if I was a member of the legislature, I'd be really interested in that, because that goes back to employment. It goes back to, jobs, obviously. And the only thing I see in the report is kind of under that last section under employers. But, it's a paradigm shift of really focusing on workforce development and helping the different industries, develop a home base for workforce. So Sarah likes that, don't you, Sarah?
I do. And one of the ideas that we've had, from the administration for a few years now, as funding is yet always scarce, is that if we could expand the availability of internships, paid internships for students attending a Vermont college, there is quite a bit of evidence that there's a good return on that investment, that if you can give them a paid internship, even if it's only an 8-week internship, right, that comes with at least an opportunity to apply for work, that those students are both likely to work for those employers. The employers are more connected with the course of study, and that for out-of-state students, they're more likely to stay here in the state of Vermont. So to the extent that maybe we can highlight at least the paid work experiences during college, that I 100% support that. In addition to everything else you said.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time, I sent Sophia the studies and the reports about healthcare workforce and the significant problem we're going to have over the next several years filling a huge number of open positions that we're going to be experiencing, if not right now. But I think that's a value proposition for the university system is how can the university system help develop a workforce moving forward for Vermont?
I need to add to that from my frame, though. It's not just for Vermont, because I can now recruit anywhere. And COVID has proven that I can hire anywhere. No longer am I dependent upon hiring in Vermont. Our Vermont people need to be able to be employed anywhere, everywhere. And that's not really in this document because we haven't gone there. The world's changed. But it's not about keeping Vermonters working in Vermont. It's about keeping Vermonters working in highly skilled and professional positions, well-paid positions.
Yeah. And just to tack onto that, as somebody who's moved from the education to the private sector and now continues to dabble in education, I see more and more job postings leaning away from a specific degree required, more about skill sets and other assets that are very clearly achieved through higher education. I think none of us would be here if we didn't believe that. But there's also a missing piece to that where, for example, at Casella, we bring somebody in out of high school, train them up in the organization, and then they're going to reach a point where they need a soft skill or a leadership training or something to take the next step in a logical career path. So to me, it's twofold. The state university system has an opportunity to be, recruiting and training up the workforce, but also to recruiting the workforce to take that next step. And we do a ton of it on our own, or we'd reach out to a local university, Southern Maine Tech in our main divisions, Castleton, VTC. I mean, it would be, to me, the opportunity is there if we could be entrepreneurial as a state college system and say, we'll package this thing up and sell it everywhere throughout the region. Because to Sandy's point, you don't need to be present to get this next level training. The employers need it to be easy. The employees need it to fit their schedule, and they need it to be applicable to what they want to do next, not what they're currently doing, right? So, I mean, that works back and forth for me with Sarah. You're talking about internships, absolutely. But there's a whole group of people that, make a decision at 18 years old to not go to college, and then they get to 24 and they've got a good job with a good company, and they just can't get a great job at that good company because there's no pathway. Unless they work for an employer who's willing to create that pathway and go to work with people like Sarah and others and find those pathways, and they're there. So it's a huge opportunity in my view to really hone in on that and make some specific recommendations to the VSC.
I'm curious from Steve and Jeff and Sandy, particularly on the business side. So the recommendation under 3D, which is a new piece, and I think this is where Brian and Dennis were trying to elevate the workforce piece. So clearly, is that not elevated enough? And should we beef that? Because I feel like that is in the executive summary, and I think it does highlight a shift, not so much necessarily from a VTC, CC, but it ups our game, but I think from a whole VSC perspective. So, so what I'm hearing is that that's not quite amplified enough. Is that what you would say?
I think economic and workforce, yeah, they're the same, but they are different.
So beefing that area up, amplifying that a little more would be helpful. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, I'm hearing some things that we can do elsewhere in the document, and I also would call attention to in the executive summary, and not to even remotely try to sound defensive, because this is really a lot of your own words. The very front of it talks about meeting states' needs and students' learner needs that are related to some of these that don't specify paid internships as a word, or upskilling, reskilling, whatever necessarily. And then I think it was Sarah who noted the bulleted list on page 6 that talks about what these recommendations will get the state of Vermont out of the VSC system if they're implemented faithfully, and moving that up. So I only mention those things just so that I'm not trying to wordsmith 3D necessarily, but to try to ensure that this sort of zeitgeist, I don't know if that's the word, this theme that we need to sort of elevate is elevated throughout at least this part of the document, as well as elsewhere throughout the.
I guess I'm kind of torn a bit on the term elevate. I'm looking at more internalized within the state university system. That it has to really come from the university system to say, we are going to play a role in workforce development in the state of Vermont. It has to come from the university system. No one can really elevate it, if you will, right? I mean, that sounds like the legislature is telling us, oh, we're going to elevate it. No, it has to come internally from the system itself, saying we are going to partner with the industries in Vermont to address workforce challenges, which then obviously address the economic. I might be wordsmithing this a little, but I do think it needs to be more internally driven.
And Steve, when I said elevate, I meant elevate in terms of making it more of a statement in this document as opposed to elevating it. I meant it so that it gets the attention of the VSC as opposed to, so I meant elevate within this document.
I'm just reading on page 2 of the executive summary. It says elevate the role. Well, but who's supposed to do the elevation?
Yep, I didn't even see that. Yep.
It's really the state college system or university system should be. Right?
So I think I wonder if part of the answer to this, I see Dan, you've had your hand up, but part of this is I think to some degree it is a matter of the legislature also specifying that one of the things we want out of the state college system is a real and consistent focus on identifying and meeting the workforce development needs of Vermonters that falls within the second recommendation as well. And so in implementing those, if the legislature makes a clear enough statement, the state college board looks at it, says this is what we're supposed to be doing. We need a mission statement that really achieves those policy objectives. One of the pieces of that is going to really sort of build, like as a state college board, we're going to expect our institutions to serve a mission of workforce development, engagement with employers, and those kinds of things in ways that perhaps they don't internalize now because it's not embedded in thematically into the daily point of view that we have. So I think that this runs throughout this section of the executive summary, and I'm trying to think about a way to make it more painfully obvious without triggering the issues related to liberal arts and whatever. But we've generated a dialogue. So Dan, you had a comment. Megan's got her hand up. Sandy's got her hand up. So Dan, what do you? What did you want to
Yeah, I mean, I know this is addressed throughout the document, but you know, as we've discussed before, and I brought up, there's a difference between student wants and workforce needs.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you have a student who comes to NVU Linden because they want to be in the music business industry program. That's their want. There may not be a job out there for them. Steve, on the other hand, has a certain, you know, he may have needs in his profession. And I think finding that balance, I mean, as an education, higher education institution, I mean, most of the students come to Linden or Castleton or VTC because they have certain interests and wants. You know what I mean? I want to be an English teacher. I want to be a computer science person. This is what I want. I don't know how many of those students actually approach higher education with the idea that, oh, okay, this business needs an engineer, so this is what I'm going to do. You get what I'm saying here? I think we have to find that balance. And from what I've read in this document, I mean, I think it would be hard to articulate that balance. It's just we have to, yes, we have to provide workforce development for people who are already in the workforce and economic, but I think we also have to find the balance and realize that many students who come to a school for a degree program probably aren't thinking what is needed in the workforce. They're being driven by what they want to do and what their interest is. And how do we find that balance is going to be really, really challenging. But I think it's key for the system to survive, to find that balance, whether it's like you said, the liberal arts. I think we've all understand the importance of the liberal arts, but how do we find that balance for the workforce and learning environment as well is difficult.
Megan?
And I would, so I would say I agree with this conversation that in terms of both continuing the liberal arts mission, but also serving adult learners, the 60,000 Vermonters who have some college but no degree, the Vermonters who maybe need to upskill to get another position or another job. And I do think it is a balance. I see that interwoven through the report, though, so I think it is interesting, and some of it will just come down to how we as a Vermont State College implement what's in the report. When I read the revisions, when I got to the new recommendation in the executive summary that suggested the legislature should set metrics to hold the system accountable, I paused in that section and thought about this very question of, should this committee be prescriptive about what those metrics are, or should that be left to the legislature? And that would be one way to be very clear on both of those goals, that more traditional measures such as retention and persistence and graduation would be measured, but there may be an addition of metrics that are more focused on upskilling the workforce, on generating job placement for folks who can work remotely. So perhaps, and I don't know if it will be appropriate for this committee to be prescriptive, but being more prescriptive there could be one way to drive that internalization.
I think that's interesting, Megan. Just to be clear, that section says that I don't think it's prescriptive about even who is to set those metrics, but presumably if the legislature specifies workforce development and the meeting workforce development needs as an expectation, then the metrics get developed to some degree around having that happen. I would be a little bit worried if the legislature without much help would set metrics like that. But Sandy, you were going to chime in.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this. The report talks a lot about the Vermont economy, workforce development in Vermont. Is there a subtle way of also acknowledging the role of innovation, innovation beyond Vermont, making sure that our populace, our students, whether they're young or adults, are prepared to to actually be employed in a larger arena, because that still feeds the Vermont economy. That still feeds workforce development. But, I'm looking on page 28, and it lists, the decline of manufacturing and education and what is emerging for healthcare, arts, entertainment, and recreation. The world's just shifted. Oh my gosh, you can do what we do, make a great salary anywhere in the US now. So we're not alone in that. So let's not lose sight of what innovation and the virtual workforce can do as far as providing great jobs for Vermonters. And there's a way of carefully weaving that in there.
Thanks. Other.
I think that's actually really important as we're coming out of the pandemic, because I think if any of you have heard some of the recent statistics about the growth of LLCs and different corporations across the country through the pandemic, this is too early to tell what it is, but we're definitely seeing more of an entrepreneurial turn in our potential labor force. And if I remember correctly, CCV may have a program of study around entrepreneurial supports that could really be well positioned at this time to take a recommendation like that and get some early wins and some successes.
We have both a certificate and an associate degree in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I know the Vermont Small Business Development Center that's based at VTC. They've had triple the number of folks that they've been working with. Now, part of that has been they've been providing COVID-related assistance and advice, but they've gone from serving 600 to 1,800, small businesses, new businesses, whatever, in terms of the work they're doing.
And Sarah, there are a couple of states, North Dakota being amongst them, where marry that idea with work experience programs where students get synced up with other entrepreneurs rather than with big companies that prove that you can make a living in a small business in a place like North Dakota. That is, those ideas come together.
The Northern Career Center already has a mentoring component that's for early childhood in some of their early childhood specialist programs. I think also is unique in our opportunities for us to kind of look and see what's been successful and could prove to be successful in other industry areas.
I think that probably the most important recommendation relates to the legislature setting some clear expectations and strategic objectives for the state university system, whether it's workforce, whether it's education, whatever it might be. But that's very prominent as the second recommendation. Everything else will flow from that. Don't you think, Sophie?
Sorry, you were saying that if getting direction from the legislature in terms of what we should do?
What should it look like moving forward? The post-secondary education, it's in number 2, in the recommendation number 2.
Well, I think that's part of the job of the board is to figure that out moving forward. But I expect that there also will be input from the legislature in terms of, again, if they're going to invest heavily in us,
right,
they're going to want to know what they're getting for that. So I fully understand that moving forward. Right. Yeah.
That comment, I think, mirrors some of what I've seen as themes that have emerged, at least from some of the focus groups that Nebi did as well, that relate to the need to really set some objectives about what the investments are supposed to accomplish. And so it dawned on me that I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure that we at least give some opportunity to go over that. And so that's a segue that may get picked up later when Charlotte gets to report on that. Any other comments on the the report, on the changes. It sounds to me like from all this that there are that we are close to hitting the mark in all of the substantive areas that we've put words around. And we may be just doing some refinements to try to make sure that the theme and the spirit of some of these remarks are more apparent. But I want to make sure, it's important to check. The FAFSA thing was a new thing, and I thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up and allowing us to have a conversation about that. I don't take from the conversation that we need to make changes to that recommendation. Correct me if I'm wrong on that or on any other content in this report that gave people anxiety. And then there's one thing specifically I want to make sure people have had a chance to say something about. But before I do that, Scott?
No, I was just kind of two things. One, on the affordability standard, I just wanted to acknowledge the changes that you all made in that. And I think that works well from a VSAC perspective. And to the point that you make, it calls upon us to start this conversation using data, largely that we already have access to. So this is work we can start with now.
Thank you. Sandy?
You said you asked what we may be uncomfortable with in the report. Page 9, when we actually called out Chancellor Spalding's very public recommendation to close, I didn't like actually specifically calling him out, the prior chancellor's recommendation, but that made me feel uncomfortable. That's up to you all.
Trying to find it.
Page 9. The 2/3 of the way down, just above the work of the select committee.
You're on the red line version. Okay. You wanted to say the former chancellors?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's just me.
I don't think that changes the meaning at all and depersonalizes it.
Thank you, Sandy, for bringing that up. I agree with you. And I think rather than naming people, we can, yeah. Because this will be a document that will live forever. And yeah. So. And
I'll look for any other. We also called Jim Page out, but only as the author of that report.
I think that's
I actually think that one's okay because it's a contract.
That's right.
We gave, right, Sophie? Wouldn't you feel okay with that?
Yeah, I think that's.
I found another one. Okay, all right. I will do a search for Spalding.
The other one, Brian, is you might want to do a search for steering, because there were a number of other places. There was one where steering committee was correct because you said the steering committee met every 2 weeks, but I think in all the other places where you have steering, I think you do mean select. So it wasn't just the one Sandy noted.
Thank you. I will one of these days. I guess I was overly optimistic in saying I thought I'd figured it out by now, but I think that's probably just residual from prior versions, or at least that's going to be my defense. Representative
And note
James?
to legislators, don't name things with the start of like 2 S's. We got to give different names.
Sorry about that.
Representative James.
Things that we're wondering about. There was a place in the report that I either mentioned for the first time or I hadn't noticed it before, but it was a passing mention to increasing funding for VSAC for aid to low-income students in the context of grant portability. And I hadn't noticed that before, or maybe it's new, but I had kind of thought that conversation was, maybe a little bit beyond the scope of the select committee report, or that we had talked about maybe not having that be part of the conversations. I don't know. It jumped out at me and I didn't remember that it had been there before. So I didn't know it was new.
Yeah, we did add something around that. I'm trying to find it. Oh, crud.
It's,
Thank you, Kathleen. I must have missed something.
Yeah, I was expecting, Scott, you to bring this one up if it was a concern. Can you tell me remind me where it is?
yeah, I just searched, sorry, I put it away. I searched portable or portability in the clean version and it came right up. Let me just, I just hadn't seen that was there.
Oh, yeah. Yep, it's on page, it's right after figure 54. I would tell you the page, but I'm looking at the red-eye version.
It's page 102 of the red line.
Well, there's actually one on, I think the one that I was thinking of is on page 83 of the red line. No, it's on page 83 of it might be the same one we're talking about. It's on page 83 of the clean version.
Right.
Scott, do you see it? The intent is to, here's the question, here's the thought process that we had, and I might be speaking with the royal we here, and so to not impugn Dennis. But one of the things that we read about, we encountered in the stakeholder engagement activities that we participated in, is some folks from different groups that have brought up the VSAC portability issue. As you can probably expect, I mean, you guys have been dealing with this on and off for years. And I recall, what Michael may remember, one of the groups that I participated in wanting to know why we didn't have the VSAC portability dollars repurposed in the document. And I was mostly just listening in, so I didn't have to answer it. But this language here was intended to address the fact that there is this issue in Vermont concerning the appropriateness or not of the portability of the existing VSAC set of funds. And what I was trying to do with this was to not worry about the current set, but any additional funding that got spent would be spent on Vermont students for attending Vermont institutions. And that's as far as that went. We had this conversation about VSAC portability, I think, early on, and generally decided, I think Kathleen has the right idea that it was either out of scope, or even if it, to the degree that it might not have been, it would be distracting from the main portion of the report. And so you're right to have noticed that this was in here, and I should have added to my list to say that there was this piece. I forgot, I wasn't trying to slip it by. But yeah, so I put something in here to talk about the additional funding that is in that table for VSAC, staying with it for Vermont residents and Vermont institutions. As is usually the case, this is for folks to debate.
So this would be the additional 5 million that you're recommending for VSAC would go to Vermont students attending UVM, the VSC, or any Vermont private institution, right? Okay.
Is that the limit of what you are articulating?
Yeah, because it says the select committee recommends an additional infusion of state funds for VSAC's budget, and then it goes on to talk about Vermont residents and Vermont attending institutions.
Well, I appreciate Kathleen bringing it up, and I guess I am a little surprised to see this kind of emerge kind of out of the blue now. But let me take a look at the language, and I'd be happy to provide more concrete feedback. It
also, and I should, as additional background, Scott, I think that we were also thinking about that those VSAC dollars in some way associated with this work study issue, the work immersion program as well. So just be bearing that in mind as you think about it. None of that's carefully articulated in here, and I don't know whether anything's to be gained by being more or less clear on this point. But it wasn't to address the existing distribution of existing aid dollars.
because I think in this regard, I would want to be clear, and I need to think this part through. Insofar as we're having a conversation about, one of the challenges with the proposal, the funding model that we have in front of us is that it doesn't necessarily directly deal with the affordability challenges, that we've identified at the outset. We're dealing with the institutional kind of finance challenges. And insofar as there's additional money that is designed to deal with that, directly, we would be supportive of that. It really is, though, the subtlety of how that interlays with the rest of the grant program is something that requires some nuance. And
You're right. And I presume that if this money were to come forward, that it would come forward with some sort of legislative provision preventing you from just mixing it in with the existing pot of money as you're distributing it. But that's a level of detail beyond which, but it might be a consideration that you want to raise.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd ask is, Scott and Brian, you guys work on the language that feels okay, because I think that we did agree that, portability is one of those things that is just way beyond the scope of this group. This could take us for the next 5 years to debate it, and then the legislature would take it on. So this is up to the legislature. This is not a new issue, and I think it's way beyond the scope of this group. So we can flag it, we can say, but I think in terms of, I think this report should be silent on the portability issue, because it's a topic. Scott is so familiar with it, and it's just one of those things that I don't want our committee to spend time debating the merits, whether it should Vermont do this. This is actually a topic for the legislature. They know the issues and they can choose to go, but it's going to be a huge distraction in this report.
To Scott's point, if this were framed as an investment in making Vermont's public institutions more affordable, that without having to go into anything beyond that, because that really is the intent.
I think
affordable for Vermont students.
If I recall, also, if this committee elects to recommend some amount of money, and right now the amount of money is 5 million, the choice was, in order to meet that objective, Dennis, I think the choices were provide money to the state colleges themselves to establish scholarships or provide financial aid internally, or to provide that funding to VSAC to defray the cost for Vermont students. If I recall, our decision was, for that problem, we should direct the funding to VSAC, understanding, of course, Scott, that you should make sure that the language is nuanced enough to sort of recognize that this is the gesture. I don't know that there was any other money in that, other than the 5 million, that actually would address affordability, other than the affordability standard and enacting some policies that going forward would help to inform those investments. But is the 5 million the sum of all of the funding to speak to the issue of actually concretely making that more affordable for some Vermont students?
I think that $17.5 million in ongoing support will help, as well as a transformation will help address affordability challenges across the board. But the additional amount is to reflect the fact that low-income students and low-middle-income students have particularly high financial bars to clear before they attend institutions. And
I think it's just that,
Scott,
yeah. I think it's just that point, Brian, why it's important that we provide the funding. If we were to say, all right, we're going to give $23.5 million to the state colleges, then we just begin to whittle it down and say, well, can't you do it with 17.5? But if we sort of parse out what the purposes of that funding is, understanding there's some secondary impact of those investments, then it provides a clearer policy choice, I think, for the legislators and the appropriators to make, in my opinion.
Well, Scott, we can bat ideas back and forth. I apologize. This was exactly the thing I was trying to make sure I didn't surprise anybody with, and I still did it anyway. And so in one case, I will defend, this language did appear in the prior version in the affordability section in a bullet that had other issues with it we had to deal with. So I moved it over here and forgot to elevate it. So anyway, we can work on that.
Good. I will reach out.
Anything else?
So if this is the airing of grievances portion of the event, I do just want to reiterate, I think it's a misstep for us to be prescriptive in even recommending a naming convention. I think everything else in this report is based on some level of research, some level of understanding. I think, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 iterations of Vermont State University. We have no idea if that's an erosion of UVM's brand. We have no idea if that would be an erosion of Castleton, NVU. It just, to me, whether we're saying this is our recommendation or not, it's in that report. And I don't think we have any research that should position a name one way or the other here. I think that's up to Sophie, the VSC, to do the research, to understand the cost, to determine naming conventions, and that should not be under our charge here. So, I mean, I understand I bring this up a lot. It is sort of my background, and I just, making marketing decisions and brand decisions without any type of research to back it up seems like a really tough place to be, especially when we're in the financial straits that we are.
So that's an easy fix. So I will go in and remove references to Vermont State University and just call it some generic lower, all with lower cases thing. Unified institution or something like that. Any more airing of grievances?
Okay. On to the feats of strength.
I think that what we've got, it's Monday. We owe the legislature a report by Friday. I don't think you've given me an impossible task to go through and find some spots to make some adjustments. It sounds like we could go forward like we did with the December report, with folks being comfortable with this report, but I am anticipating you'd like to see the last version before it goes in. And Scott and I have some work to do in particular. So if I can, is Wednesday too late? I don't think it can be any later than that.
Brian, I think if you got it to us at the end of day Wednesday, I think it's only fair. This is Monday. You need a couple days to do your work back and forth with Scott and others. And then when you get it to us by Wednesday, we need to get comments back to you by Thursday. When? Because you need to get something out to the legislature.
Yeah, and it needs to get, because of other things on a commitment I made some time ago on Friday. That's a meeting at 2 my time, which with Eastern time, I want to make sure that the legislature gets a copy of this before the business day is out on Friday anyway. So if you can get it to me, so if I get it to you on Wednesday evening, and I'll try to be faster than that, Thursday, close of business for me, which would be 7 o'clock for you.
So Brian, will you send this group in red line will just be the changes from the
Today.
report you got over the weekend to the report. So there's not going to be a significant number, but
So you'll see the clean version that you're for today with the few red line changes.
And the only dilemma I have is that this document is now so large that I'm worried that people might have attachment size limits on their emails. But I guess you all got the version I sent, all three of them. So maybe I'm worrying about that too much. So anyway, that's what I'll do. I'll send you a Word version in red line so you can click the next button and it'll take you right to where the next change is. And then I'll have it ready for you, both Joyces on Friday.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. So is Michael Thomas on? Or
nope.
He's not.
Charlotte, do you want, I know that we have, Candace is not able to be with us today. Just as background, she conducted 3 really well-attended focus groups, not last week, the week before. I have to say I attended, I know some of you were able to join. It was a pretty impressive group of 3 different groups, but what was even more impressive is how much time they had actually spent with the report and how well informed they were. And so I know that Candace sent us a summary of the focus group comments. And Charlotte, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, but I just really want to acknowledge Nebby's work and the work. They took the names that a lot of us had sent to them, pulled them together, and the attendance was pretty amazing. So Charlotte, anything you want to add?
Not a lot to add. We obviously want to extend a huge thank you to everyone who participated in those groups. It was really fascinating to gain additional perspectives and thoughts that we hadn't thought through yet. And I think this summary covers almost everything that we mentioned. And so I would encourage you all to send us any questions that you have on this. But otherwise, I don't really have a whole lot else to add other than a big thank you for everyone's time, because I know it was a lot of time. I was also in all 3 groups, and it was a lot of time.
And just as a reminder, this is, I think Nebby, don't quote me on this. I think Candace told me that she's done 11 focus groups since the beginning of this process. So we haven't, and they've all been different configurations of people. So it's 11 different groups, inviting comment early on, inviting comment of the report. And so I think it is a reflection of, I think this group really trying to make sure that we not only are all of our deliberations public, and we posted all the comments and all the questions, but also we've specifically invited a lot of feedback from a lot of groups. And so I just, I'm grateful to that. And I'm really grateful to Nebby for convening that many focus groups, because as you know, it takes a lot. You got to send out invitations, you got to send out questions, but then the focus group participants have all been, it's been impressive in terms of how much time they have spent with the report. So this is a report that this information has been widely circulated throughout Vermont. So I think as a select committee, I think we should take some pride in the fact that it hasn't been the 15 of us that have developed this report. We have, thanks to NCHEMS, they have been sort of the engines behind this, but we've helped to guide it and share our reflections. But then also we've put it out there to the public and invited a lot of public feedback. So if nothing else, this has certainly been vetted by a lot of different groups. I guess I would turn to this group and just ask if there's anything else that you want to raise for today's meeting. And Joyce Manchester, I will just ask you, have we had any comments from the public or questions from the public?
Today we have none.
Okay. All right. And, but the thing is, if we do get them, we will, as we have always done, circulate them. I do, Megan Kluver sent a really, really thought-provoking piece about sort of hybrid. As we think about moving from COVID to post-COVID, what higher ed might look like, what traditional schools will be, some of the challenges. And I have asked Candace to distribute that to select committee members and to post it as a resource. So you'll be getting that in the next few days when Candace returns. So with that, the last thing I would say is just a reminder, our assignment, Brian will be sending us the report by Wednesday. Please get him comments back by Thursday. Our next select committee meeting will be on March 1st, not March 8th. Again, you'll get invitations, but we needed to shift that around. Well, I have everyone here. Just raise your hand, a thumbs up or thumbs down. Could you start at 2:30 instead of 3:30 on Monday the 1st? I'm trying to accommodate Senator Baruch's schedule because he now teaches on Mondays. Can people start at 3:30 on a Monday instead of, 2:30 instead of 3:30?
Yes. Yes.
Anybody can. Steve's a iffy, but maybe. Okay, Scott. All right. All right, we'll try. Steve, I hope you can join us. But we won't make it, if you can't do 2:30, please let me know right away. Because Candace will be gone for a few days, and so we won't be making this decision till then, but I'm trying to thread the needle with Senator Baruch.
If you can just send out a meeting invite
Okay.
with enough notice, I can move. We're in the middle of budget meeting, so. Yeah.
Yes, I will ask her to, Candace is due back very soon, and so I'll ask her to send a new invite.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, with that, I would like to adjourn. Again, I want to thank you all. This is the first group, I have to say, that we have 100% participation, and I am just, thank you. Thank you for giving up this time for this really important work. So with that, I will see you March 1st. The days will be longer. I just want to acknowledge that it's 5:15 and it's still daylight here in the East. So.